For the longest time, I have been advocating to have young people in national negotiating teams and in climate negotiations because, frankly, what we are negotiating, what we are deciding, is not about us. It is about the next generations. So they ought to have a voice. They ought to be actively participating. Over the years, I have seen more and more country delegations involve young people, but it is not anywhere near to where we ought to be with respect to the voice of young people.
So a tipping point is where a small change makes a big difference to a system, and in the Earth's climate there are a bunch of tipping points we could cross as we keep warming the world up, leading to abrupt and often irreversible changes with big impacts on our societies. We're very close to crossing some tipping points now at 1.2 or 1.3 degrees C of warming. In fact, we can't rule out we've crossed a tipping point for the loss of both the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet. And if they're in irreversible collapse eventually, that'll give us more than 10 metres of sea level rise over many centuries. And we know a host of other tipping points could be looming close. Positive tipping points are where changes in behaviour or technology that are essential to shutting down fossil fuel burning and greenhouse gas emissions become self-propelling changes. If we can trigger positive tipping points and accelerate action at least 5 times to shut down greenhouse gas emissions, then we can avoid an unmanageable future of escalating bad tipping points in the climate. What needs to change right now is the pace of action on climate change. Young people have crucial roles to play in solving the climate crisis. They need to speak truth to power, and power has to listen and respond.
With the global tipping points failing, it's depressing thinking about the future of my country. In Kiribati, we live 2 meters above sea level, and we don't even know if in 50 years we'll be able to live on our land. My passion for advocacy was born out of frustration with the inaction of world leaders. Kiribati's contribution to the global carbon emissions is 0.001%. Most of the bigger countries haven't faced most of the effects of climate change yet, but we are, and that's our reality. And we might be the first ones, but we won't be the last if there's not enough climate action done. In Kiribati, our path into climate advocacy is different from other countries. While young people in most other countries advocate or fight against their own government, in Kiribati, we work alongside our government in the fight against climate change. Last year at COP28, it was the first time I attended COP as part of Kiribati's first ever youth delegation. I was fortunate enough to speak on several panels and to meet with international delegates at COP to raise awareness of the frontline struggles that we are facing in Kiribati. As part of my advocacy, I am involved with a Kiribati youth-led organization called Sungaru Youth Action. It is a platform for young people to have a voice. And so we provide a network of like-minded young people. We also try to mobilize our young people to take care of our lands. We do cleanups and mangrove plantings to give back to the land. Even 1 centimeter of sea level rise can be devastating for island states like ours. But there can still be hope. While we cannot turn back the clock, there is still time to ensure the existing issues are not exacerbated, but we have to act now.
Extreme weather and climate events are changing in all regions of the world. There are many threats associated with those changes in extreme weather events and extreme climate events. For instance, in case of heat waves, there are impacts on health. We can already say some people are dying of the consequences of human-induced climate change. There also impact on ecosystem and the potential for further amplification of the climate crisis. So with change in drought, We can have in some regions also vegetation that is dying, and this leads to a further emission of CO2, which further amplifies the change in the climate system. There are also several threats for tropical regions, for instance, associated with tropical cyclone, where we see that the proportion of extreme events, so the most intense events, is increasing. Also, the heavy precipitation associated with such events is increasing, and there is a combination with sea level rise, which means that there is increased risk for coastal inundation. What everybody should have in mind about what is at stake is that we are speaking of a global crisis. So those changing climate extremes, they don't happen in isolation in single location. Those increases we are seeing, they're happening everywhere at the same time. And that's a major threat of this crisis, is that these global dimensions means that you have basically no alternative in some cases when impacts are felt. It is essential to involve young people in decision making, because we are speaking really of decisions which are going to affect the world in the coming decades. It's, as mentioned, it's really about their future, and that's why it's important to involve their perspective in this decision making.
When Super Typhoon struck, I was 16 years old. I felt terrified. You know, the wind was deafening, the rain was relentless. I felt like the world was collapsing around us. We literally went back to zero. Like, our house collapsed, all of our things are not there anymore. And it was the point when I was questioning, like, what's the future like? At that point, it was really all about survival. I just refused to accept that this would be the new normal. And I realized, that our community and community like ours around the world were suffering from a crisis we did not cause. So the Climate Justice Liability Petition is asking the Commission on Human Rights to investigate 47 carbon majors for their human rights violations linked to climate change. We submitted the petition in 2015, and it was signed by thousands of people. And after 7 years of battling with carbon majors, going back and forth, we won, and that was historic for us. I'm still very much involved in climate activism, climate action in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia. In fact, my best friend and I has just established an institute called Institute for Youth and Climate Diplomacy, which aims to empower Southeast Asian youth leaders to be in climate diplomacy spaces. Young people have been at the forefront of climate innovation and activism. We've demonstrated that we are effective agents of change, and excluding us from negotiations is a missed opportunity for progress. The future of our planet is non-negotiable, and we cannot afford half measures or delays. And every moment of inaction means more lives lost, more communities devastated, and more ecosystems destroyed. And for policymakers, integrating young people into your teams is very important. Because we bring solutions, youth bring solutions, we bring drive and the energy that can transform negotiations and accelerate action.
Loss and damage for climate change mean it is when the climate impact a people, impact a community, or impact a land. There are some losses. People can lose their home from an extreme weather event like floods. That is what is happening right now where I am in Chad. We are losing completely our culture, our identity, and then the children that are going to grow up, they are going to grow in no culture, in no identity. As indigenous peoples, we are losing a lot of our knowledge based on the plants, based on the animals, based on observations of our nature. What I do not understand in the climate negotiation, in the loss and damage, are they aware about the urgency that we are talking about? Are they aware about the losses that we are living? there is some progress, of course, because when they accept and adopt the loss and damage finance at the COP28, this is one step. They also established the advisory board of the loss and damage, where there is a representative from indigenous peoples, from youth, and from women. But are they advancing in the right direction or soon? Everyone needs to recognize the leadership of indigenous peoples, the leadership of the youth.
One of the biggest problems and challenges that face most of the climate finance, unfortunately until now, including the Loss and Damage Fund, is that the countries who are mostly in need, who are mostly vulnerable, don't have the capacities or the means to access this climate finance. A very good example for that would be my beloved, very own country, Sudan, where we are now reaching almost a year and a half of a very devastating war, and we are also witnessing very devastating floods. So I came up with an idea of establishing a network in conflict-affected countries that works and serves as a somehow alternative governance structures, only for the purpose of climate change and climate action and building the resilience of the communities during the times of the conflict, in order to be able to receive international financing, because people need and deserve to have at least a local movement that can serve their interests first, not the interests of the government. This year, COP29 is almost my 10th COP. We were talking about youth inclusion for a long time, and now it's high time to speak about meaningful youth inclusion. I am not here as a compliment or a ticking box. Listening to us is not a privilege, it's actually an obligation.
Food systems produce part of the problem of our global climate crisis, but at the same time they suffer the consequences. Climate change basically leads to more frequent climate extremes, bigger climate extremes, and those are a big problem for food systems. So drought events can knock out harvests, kill livestock, tropical storms can wipe out processing and storage facilities, flood events can interrupt access to markets, heat waves in cities can lead to faster food loss. But it's not only those extreme events that are a problem. Farmers can also not really rely any longer on the traditional knowledge that they have inherited from previous generations, what to plant, when to plant, whether to plant at all. And working in the World Food Programme, it is very clear that this is also a humanitarian problem. So more than 700 million people are chronically food insecure right now. 282 million people are facing crisis or emergency levels of hunger. It's more than double the number we have seen in 2019. To me, climate change is an intergenerational justice issue at heart. So how can we negotiate decisions that have impacts in 10 to 20 years from now without involving those people that will be directly affected? So I would really love to see young people in climate negotiations, but with the right color of badges. At the moment they have yellow badges, most of them for observers, but it's the pink ones for delegates that they need.
In the Gambia, agriculture is very much significant. It contributes 1/4 to our country's GDP. Most of these farmers, especially in the rural communities, where 70% of the inhabitants live below the poverty line, all depend on farming to feed their families, but also to earn a living. Climate change has severely devastated our country, especially the farming communities. And because of sea level rise, increase in temperatures, low precipitation, and so on, farming in most of these communities is no more lucrative. Because if you look at the sea level rise, it's not only causing flooding, but it's also contributing to what we call saltwater intrusion. And if that happens, most of these farmers are not able to make high yields. And because of that, you have a lot of people now moving, because they are being displaced from their communities in the rural areas, trying to move to the urban areas. But even some people risking their life through the Mediterranean, trying to travel to the Europe using boats across the Mediterranean Sea. Last year, 2 of my brothers tried to cross the Mediterranean Sea to get to the Europes, but really could not make it, and they had to lose their lives. Last year, I was fortunate to be among the 100 delegates by the COP28 presidency. This was a significant step in terms of including young people in the climate policy processes. We've been able to go through rigorous training on mastering climate negotiations, and we have been given a space at a personal level. My government gave me a government badge, and I was able to attend climate negotiations where I was attached to our climate finance lead negotiator. With support from Yongo and the government of the Gambia, I've been able to introduce the local conferences of youth on climate change in the Gambia. And we are planning to bring more than 200 young people to discuss pertinent issues about climate change in the Gambia, and there's necessary steps that we need to take as a country to be able to address these issues and build the resilience of our communities and our ecosystems. It is important for young people to take practical action on climate change because we are not only victims of climate change, but we are people who are able to provide solutions to the devastating impacts of climate change.
Climate change is already having very significant effects on human health, both direct effects, such as those of extreme heat on people who have to work outside in extremely hot weather, for example, and indirect effects, such as through the food system, where problems such as drought, flooding, loss of water supplies is leading to reduced crop yields, changing patterns of agriculture, reductions in food security, reductions in water security. Young people will both endure that greater burden of things worsening over time, and they will have to endure it for a greater proportion of their lives. So they will have to live for longer than people like me, with the stress and uncertainty around those harms, with major effects on mental health and well-being, as well as on their physical health. If we are to succeed at tackling the climate crisis, we need urgently to involve young people meaningfully in policy making and decision making. It's incredibly important. My generation and those before mine have profoundly failed, but we continue to pretend that we deserve to be in charge. We need to end this destructive arrogance and pass on power to people who have the energy and the drive and the knowledge and the understanding and the capacity to do something where we have failed.
When I was 17 years old, I had to move from my home country, Venezuela, due to its political and economic crisis, to Bogota with my siblings. Bogota is a huge city. We're talking about 10 million people, and sadly, it's also a very polluted city. So I was born with asthma, and sadly, my asthma got worse as I arrived to Bogota. That has been an ongoing thing in my life. When I moved to New York, now suddenly we didn't have air pollution from trucks, but we have these massive wildfires. And my first 3 months in New York were the same as being super worried that I was going to land in a hospital due to the smoke of wildfires. And that's what air pollution does. It reminds me a lot of how my own forced displacement was, because it takes away your agency and your capacity to choose. El derecho a no obedecer, or the right to not obey in English, is a social platform that empowers young people to influence public policies and influence social narratives. We work on climate action and clean air, refugees' rights, and civic engagement. To influence the mindset of people in Colombia around clean air, particularly in Bogota, I installed a giant pair of cotton lungs in the middle of one of the busiest public transport stations in the city. And I saw them as they became darker with the day and with air pollution. They started pretty white and they ended up pretty dark. And that symbol alone, it became a nationwide symbol for people to advocate for clean air in their own communities. And that led to the creation of a youth-led roundtable in the Intergovernmental Action Plan, to so many young people being involved in air pollution in their own communities, and to open the conversation to what would be, years later, the National Clean Air Policy of Colombia. Young people offer a unique and very different set of experience. Young, diverse, Black and brown, indigenous, refugees, women, and children, not only older young people. And we need to make sure that all of these are involved in the negotiation room, but also in the negotiation teams, that states understand that the effects of the climate crisis are disproportionately affecting the next generations, and we want those generations to be part of the negotiations team in understanding how do I want my country to lead climate action for my generation and for the ones that are coming after me.
My first experience of a direct climate impact was back in 2021. Here in British Columbia, we experienced an unprecedented heat dome that lasted for 27 days and actually caused over 600 heat-related deaths in the province. Wildfires were burning across the whole province, but especially around where my grandparents lived, meaning that they had to be evacuated from their home due to the intensity of the smoke. And I remember how the sky was blotted out, that you could barely see the sun. And I remember my throat was stinging, my eyes and my nose was burning. When disasters or other climate impacts hit, they can have a wide range of impacts on our mental health. And so for some people, if that isn't supported, it can lead to, anxiety about, okay, is this going to happen again? What will I do the next time it happens? But also a lot of grief, because of what was lost. We need to think of climate resilience in terms of emotional and social resilience. Young people especially feel burnt out about the prospects of the climate crisis, primarily because this is something we're going to be working on for our whole lives. And so it's essential that we support them to sustain their climate activism for the long haul.
The climate crisis is directly affecting biodiversity, nature in many ways, in particular, really as an accelerant to the crisis that we're seeing in nature through increased flooding, increased storm surges, increased droughts. All of that is impacting biodiversity. And that is, again, causing an acceleration in the degradation of our planet. So nature has an absolutely critical role when it comes to the fight against the climate crisis. But it's often forgotten, so it's essential that we recognize that nature has 30% of the solution and that we invest in protecting what's left and we restore what we've lost. It's critical that young people are actually at the table. Often, I think, policymakers who are of a different generation think that, well, they don't need young people to actually co-design policy. I firmly disagree with that. All of the things that we're trying to do in the nature and climate space, they have to have young people, not only young people's voice, but actually their voice in the right rooms, at the right tables, making the right decisions.
South Coast Kenya is facing a lot of challenges in terms of the connection between nature and community. When we encounter sea level rises, a lot of areas in this part of Kenya, the coast area, experience a lot of flooding, and this has led to destruction of forests, of homes, of wetlands, of rivers, which has led to decrease in terms of our biodiversity in this aspect. As Mazangiri Initiative, we have been able to work with our 42 Indigenous women into this mangrove restoration, which is one of our key focus. And through this, we have been able to plant or restore 10,000 mangroves in a place called Funzi Island. But climate change in terms of sea level rise has caused rampant of infringement of salty water that affects the levels of salinity that the mangroves deserve to survive in. So when we have a lot of these level rises, it leads to effects in terms of the marine life that exists in these mangroves. It is important for young people to take part in climate action because we are the leaders of today and we are charged up to fight and bring justice to our world. So having every youth taking action will bring more about fresh ideas, new solutions, new innovations on how we can prevent and mitigate climate change effects. My call to action to the world leaders, policymakers and negotiators for this year's COP29 is for them to act with ambition, for them to act with accountability, and for them to act with inclusivity, for them to deliver the so long committed climate commitments.
we need long-view leadership, thinking beyond short-term political cycles to deliver solutions for both current and future generations. And this means showing the determination to actually solve problems, intractable problems, seemingly intractable problems, not just manage them, and to do it with wisdom to make decisions based on science and reason, and the humility to listen to all of those who are affected. I'm very keen on the involvement at all levels of young people, young leaders, because literally the future is being decided over the next few years. And what I mean by the future is the future of our world. Will it be a livable world, or will it become more and more difficult as it heats up? And this is vital to younger people and indeed future generations. So we actually need all that urgency and enthusiasm of young people. We need to be prisoners of hope, as Archbishop Tutu taught me, and we need to believe that these are human problems and we can solve them because we must, and the time is now.
When I was 20, I decided that I was going to create my own NGO. It's called Último Recurso, as the last appeal or the last resource, and it's the first and only Portuguese climate litigation organization, and it's focused on climate law and using all the legal tools that we have to fight climate change and protect the human rights. In order to define our first action, we needed to answer the question, who is the most responsible person or entity in Portugal for climate change? And the answer was the state, the Portuguese state. So we decided that we're going to sue the state. In 2023, I was in Brazil doing an exchange program, and I received a call from the presidency of Portugal. And the president of Portugal wanted me to be an advisor for him. I have the privilege to meet with the president of Portugal every month, and my job is to make sure that the president of Portugal is well aware of everything that is going on climate change, and I have concrete proposals to him on what he can do to fight climate change. Right now, everyone wants a young face, a young person at the table, and it's very difficult to tell if it's because they want to listen what we have to say, or they just want the picture to post on social media. Education is important to tell the difference between youth washing and meaningful youth engagement. But more than that, I think what really matters is to provide youth with the resources they need to have a real impact on the society. And this means finance, capacity building, and training. I think it's important to young people to be at the negotiating room, because if it's our future that's being discussed, we need to be there, we need to have a voice and to have a proposal. Otherwise, we are letting others to decide what our future looks like.
Young people from around the world have lived experience of climate change impacts and ideas for climate solutions which the world needs in order to build a climate-just future.
We are more likely to think long-term because we will be living the consequences of these negotiations for decades to come.
I think young people should have the same space in the negotiations, in the official negotiations, as the government representatives.
They can use their drive, energy and passion to push for change through advocacy and action.
But also they can bring the necessary urgency to action that we need right now.
Young people have the tools and the knowledge to change the climate crisis.
Participation cannot be only a checking box or checking list.
Our words need to be listened to and acted upon.
We are charged up to fight and bring justice to our world.
In the end, what we are deciding right now is going to affect the world we know.
We need to step back and let young people be at the table leading.
Either we change the way we live and our relation with the planet, or climate will change everything for us.
You can do it. You just need the right political will to do it.
Obviously, the worst impacts are going to be felt by the youngest people if we don't act now.
What we are negotiating, what we are deciding, is not about us. It is about the next generations.
To the global leaders and negotiators at COP29, I urge you to recognize the voices of young people in addressing the global climate crisis. Our future depends on decisive and inclusive action now. Thus, I encourage you to move from commitment to action, as this is what will secure our today and safeguard the tomorrow.